47 secretaries quit before Friday, but the one everyone called a disaster would become the reason a millionaire learned how to live again. The soft hum of conversations drifted through the glass walls of Walker Technologies' executive floor, mixing with the distant tapping of keyboards and the muted ringing of office phones. On the 42nd floor overlooking downtown Chicago, nobody smiled when they passed the corner office. Nobody lingered. Nobody knocked unless absolutely necessary. Because behind those dark oak doors sat Damian Walker, the billionaire CEO employees referred to in whispers as the Ice King. 37 years old. Worth more than $1 billion. Feared by nearly everyone who worked for him. Sophie Bennett knew none of that when she rushed through the revolving doors at 8:02 a.m., balancing a cardboard tray with 2 coffees, a leather tote bag, and a folder she had nearly forgotten on her apartment kitchen counter. Her blonde hair was half pinned back and half escaping the clip. A loose shoelace dragged against the polished marble floor. "Not today," she muttered under her breath. "Please, not today." The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than it should have. She could feel her pulse in her throat. This job wasn't just another opportunity. It was survival. 3 months behind on student loan payments. Rent increasing again next month. A savings account that barely covered groceries. She needed this position more than she wanted to admit. The elevator doors opened. Sophie hurried forward. The executive assistant from Human Resources pointed toward a conference room. "You're already late. By 2 minutes." To Damian Walker, 2 minutes is late. Sophie swallowed. That sounded encouraging. She entered the conference room just as a dozen executives settled into their seats around a massive walnut table. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan shimmered beneath the morning sun. At the head of the tables sat Damian Walker himself. Tailored charcoal suit. Crisp white shirt. Dark hair perfectly styled. Steel gray eyes fixed on a presentation screen. He didn't even glance up when she entered. Somehow that felt worse. Sophie quietly moved toward an empty chair near the back, trying to disappear. "The Henderson acquisition closes today," Damian said, his voice calm and controlled. "Any mistakes will cost this company approximately $50 million. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed too loudly. Sophie carefully stepped around a chair leg. Her loose shoelace caught. Time seemed to slow. The cardboard coffee tray tilted. 1 cup slid. Then another. Hot coffee launched across the room like it had its own plans for the morning. Gasps erupted. One executive jumped backward. Another grabbed a stack of documents. Brown liquid splashed across the conference table and directly onto a collection of signed acquisition papers. Silence followed. Complete silence. Sophie froze. Her face turned crimson. Somewhere in the distance a coffee cup rolled across the floor and tipped onto its side. Every eye in the room shifted toward Damian Walker. This was it. Day 1. Over before it began. Sophie opened her mouth. "I am so sorry." Damian slowly stood. His expression revealed nothing. No anger. No surprise. Somehow that was more terrifying. He picked up one of the stained pages and looked at it. Around him, executives exchanged nervous glances. One man subtly reached for his phone, probably expecting to witness another famous firing. After all, nobody lasted long working for Damian Walker. Certainly not someone who had just interrupted a $50 million meeting with flying coffee. Sophie braced herself. But instead of raising his voice, Damian looked directly at her for the first time. Those gray eyes studied her face for several long seconds. Then he said something nobody expected. "Be here tomorrow at 8. The room collectively stopped breathing. Sophie blinked. "What?" "You heard me." Damian placed the paper down. Meeting adjourned. And just like that, he walked out of the room, leaving behind confused executives, ruined paperwork, and one clumsy young woman who had no idea why the coldest millionaire in Chicago had just given her a second chance. Sophie barely remembered how she made it through the rest of that day. Long after the executives left the conference room, She was still standing beside the stained table, staring at the coffee disaster that should have ended her employment before it even began. Instead, Damien Walker had told her to come back tomorrow. Nobody seemed to understand why. The moment she stepped into the hallway, employees looked at her as if she had survived a natural disaster. One woman from accounting actually stopped and asked, "Are you still employed?" Sophie laughed nervously. "Apparently." The woman blinked twice. "That has never happened before." By lunchtime, Sophie had learned more about Damien Walker than she wanted to know. 47 executive assistants had either quit or been dismissed over the past 5 years. One lasted 3 days. Another lasted 4 hours. Someone else reportedly cried in the elevator and never returned. The stories spread through the office like urban legends. Damien expected perfection. Damien hated excuses. Damien noticed everything. Sophie should have been terrified. Instead, she was confused. Because when she replayed the meeting in her head, she remembered something strange. He had looked at her for several seconds before making his decision. Not at the spilled coffee. Not at the ruined documents. At her. As if he had been searching for something. That evening, Sophie returned to her apartment on the north side of the city. Apartment was a generous description. The studio measured barely 400 square feet. The refrigerator rattled every few minutes. The heating system worked only when it felt inspired. She dropped her keys onto the counter and opened her banking application. The number staring back at her made her stomach tighten. Rent was due in 12 days. Student loan notices filled her email inbox. Medical bills from her mother's final year still lingered like ghosts she could not outrun. Sophie closed the application before the anxiety could fully settle in. She crossed the room and stopped beside a framed photograph sitting on a small shelf. Her mother smiled back at her from a summer afternoon years earlier. Healthy. Happy. Alive. Sophie gently touched the frame. "I got through day 1. She whispered. "Barely." The silence that followed felt familiar. It had been almost a year since her mother passed away, but some evenings still felt impossibly quiet. Her mother had always been the person who reminded her that mistakes did not define her. That kindness mattered more than perfection. Sophie wished she could hear that voice now. The next morning she arrived 20 minutes early. No coffee. No loose shoelaces. No opportunities for disaster. The executive floor remained unusually quiet. As she organized schedules outside Damien's office, she noticed something sitting on the corner of his desk through the partially open door. A silver pocket watch. Old-fashioned. Scratched from years of use. Damien entered moments later and stopped when he saw her looking toward it. For the first time, something flickered across his expression. Not anger. Not annoyance. Something softer. Gone almost instantly. Without a word, he picked up the watch and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he walked past her. "Conference room in 10 minutes. Sophie nodded. "Yes, sir." As he disappeared down the hallway, she found herself wondering why a billionaire carried a worn pocket watch that looked older than he was. And why, for a brief second, holding it seemed more important to him than anything else in the building. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Sophie arrived early, organized Damien's schedule, answered calls, coordinated meetings, and spent every hour waiting for the mistake that would finally get her fired. Yet somehow it never came. That did not mean things were easy. Damien remained distant. His instructions were brief. His expectations were impossibly high. More than once, Sophie found herself running across the executive floor carrying documents he needed 5 minutes earlier. But beneath the intimidating reputation and the cold exterior, she began noticing details nobody seemed to mention. Damien was always the first person in the building and usually the last to leave. Some nights, when the city lights reflected against the glass walls of his office, Sophie could still see his silhouette working long after everyone else had gone home. One Thursday evening, nearly 3 weeks into her job, she stayed late preparing materials for an investor presentation. The office was unusually quiet. Most employees had already left. As she walked toward the printer room, she noticed a light still glowing beneath Damien's office door. Curious, she glanced through the partially open doorway. Damien sat alone behind his desk. The expensive suit jacket was gone. His tie hung loosely around his neck. For the first time, he looked less like a billionaire CEO and more like a man carrying a weight nobody else could see. Then she noticed it. The silver pocket watch rested open beside his laptop. Damien was staring at it. Not reading emails. Not reviewing reports. Just staring. His expression had changed completely. The sharp confidence that intimidated board members was gone. In its place sat something quieter. Sadder. Sophie immediately looked away, feeling as though she had accidentally walked into a private conversation. She returned to her desk and continued working. An hour later, she heard movement in the hallway. Damien emerged from his office carrying several folders. As he passed her desk, one sheet slipped from the stack and drifted onto the floor. Sophie stood quickly and picked it up. Before she could hand it back, her eyes landed on a handwritten page tucked among the documents. It was not a business report. It was a list. A personal list. At the top, written in neat blue ink, were the words, "Things I have not done since May 14th. Sophie froze. Below the title were simple entries. Gone to a baseball game. Taken a vacation. Celebrated a birthday. Visited the lake. Played my favorite song." Each line carried a small check box beside it. Every box was empty. Her heart tightened. May 14th. Whatever had happened on that date had changed everything. Damien gently took the papers from her hands before she could read more. For a brief moment their eyes met. Neither spoke. Then Damien slipped the list back into the folder. "You should go home, Sophie." His voice sounded softer than usual. "It is almost 9 o'clock. Sophie nodded. "You should too." The words escaped before she could stop them. Damien actually looked surprised. A faint expression crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite disbelief. Something in between. Then he glanced toward the pocket watch visible inside his office. "Maybe someday," he said quietly. As he walked away, Sophie found herself thinking about the list. About the empty check boxes. About the mysterious date. And for the first time since joining Walker Technologies, she realized she was no longer wondering why Damien had kept her. She was beginning to wonder what had broken him. The following Monday began with rain tapping softly against the glass walls of Walker Technologies. Chicago looked gray and distant beneath the clouds, but inside the executive floor something unusual happened. Damien Walker arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. Several employees noticed immediately. Nobody dared comment. Sophie noticed too when he placed 1 cup on her desk without explanation. "You forgot yours this morning," he said. Before she could answer, he disappeared into his office. Sophie stared at the cup for several seconds. It was exactly how she ordered it from the cafe downstairs. Somehow he had remembered. That realization stayed with her all day. Over the next few weeks, small changes began appearing in places nobody expected. During a late meeting with investors, Sophie accidentally mentioned that she had never visited the observation deck at Willis Tower despite living in Chicago for years. One of the executives laughed and said everyone eventually crossed things off their bucket list. The words triggered something. Sophie remembered Damien's handwritten list. The empty check boxes. The life he seemed to have stopped living. 2 days later, while organizing documents before a client dinner, she noticed the list partially visible beneath a folder on his desk. Gone to a baseball game. Empty. Visited the lake. Empty. Played my favorite song. Empty. Before she could stop herself, she grabbed a pen and drew a tiny smiley face beside one of the unchecked boxes. The moment she did it, she realized how reckless it was. She quickly returned the list and pretended nothing had happened. That evening Damien called her into his office. Sophie immediately assumed she was about to be fired. Again. Damien sat behind his desk holding the list. Her smiley face stared back at her from the page. You drew on this? Sophie swallowed. Technically, yes. Why? Because it looked sad. Silence filled the office. Then, unexpectedly, Damien leaned back in his chair. A list can look sad? That one can. To her surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. The expression lasted barely a second before disappearing. Yet it was the first genuine hint of amusement she had ever seen from him. The next Friday, an important client canceled a dinner meeting at the last minute. Damien remained in the office reviewing contracts, while the rain poured outside. Sophie was preparing to leave when she noticed an old advertisement on her computer screen. A local baseball game. The Chicago Cubs. One night only. She hesitated. Then she walked into his office. Can I make a completely unprofessional suggestion? Damien looked up. That sounds dangerous. Probably. She placed the advertisement on his desk. Go to a baseball game. He stared at it. I do not have time. You own the company. That is exactly why I do not have time. Sophie folded her arms. You have not checked off a single item on that list. The room became quiet. Damien looked at the paper. Then toward the city skyline beyond the windows. Finally, he opened a desk drawer and removed the silver pocket watch. His thumb brushed across its worn surface. Something softened in his eyes. Not happiness. Not yet. But something close to possibility. You are unusually persistent for someone who spilled coffee on a $50 million deal. Sophie smiled. And you are unusually stubborn for someone who keeps carrying around a list of things he misses. For a moment neither looked away. Then Damien did something nobody in the company would have believed. He picked up a pen. Slowly, deliberately, he drew a small check mark beside one item on the list. And for the first time since Sophie had met him, she had the feeling that a door buried deep inside him had begun to open. Over the next month, something remarkable happened inside Walker Technologies. Nobody announced it. Nobody scheduled a meeting about it. Yet. Everyone noticed. Damien Walker stopped replacing assistants. The realization spread through the building slowly at first. Then all at once. Sophie Bennett had survived a month. Then 5 weeks. Then 6. The milestone became office gossip. Employees who had barely spoken to her before now stopped by her desk just to confirm she was still there. One afternoon, a marketing manager leaned across her workstation and whispered, Do you realize you are officially the longest-serving executive assistant he has had in years? Sophie nearly dropped her pen. That cannot be true. It is. The woman laughed. People are placing bets on whether you make it to 3 months. Sophie shook her head. That is slightly concerning. But beneath the jokes, the atmosphere on the executive floor had begun to change. Damien still demanded excellence. He still noticed mistakes. Yet employees no longer froze when he walked into a room. Meetings felt less tense. Conversations lasted longer. Even his senior executives seemed surprised by the shift. Sophie noticed it most during late evenings. Damien no longer stayed isolated behind closed doors every night. Sometimes he walked through departments asking questions. Sometimes he thanked people for successful projects. Small gestures. Tiny changes. Yet for a man known for emotional distance, they felt enormous. One Friday afternoon, Sophie entered his office carrying a stack of contracts. She stopped when she saw the list sitting beside his computer. 3 items were now checked off. Gone to a baseball game. Visited the lake. Played my favorite song. She smiled before she could stop herself. Damien noticed immediately. What? He asked. Nothing. That smile says otherwise. Sophie pointed toward the list. You are making progress. Damien followed her gaze. For a brief moment, his expression softened. You make it sound like physical therapy. Maybe it is. He considered that. Surprisingly, he did not disagree. Later that evening, a thunderstorm rolled across Chicago. Rain hammered against the windows while lightning flickered beyond the skyline. Most employees rushed home before traffic became impossible. Sophie remained behind to finish preparing documents for a board meeting scheduled the following week. Around 7 o'clock, she walked toward the break room and found Damien standing alone near the coffee machine. Not working. Not taking calls. Just staring out the window. "You should go home," he said without turning around. Sophie laughed. "That sounds familiar." "I am serious." "So am I." For several seconds neither moved. Then Damien surprised her. "Would you like dinner?" Sophie blinked. "Dinner? The cafeteria downstairs is still open." "That is not exactly what most people mean when they invite someone to dinner." A quiet laugh escaped him. An actual laugh. Sophie nearly looked around to make sure nobody else had heard it. 20 minutes later they sat across from each other in an almost empty cafeteria, sharing sandwiches and talking about things that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings reports. Sophie told him about growing up in a small Illinois town. Damien listened. Really listened. Then she asked about his childhood. For the first time, he did not immediately change the subject. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the pocket watch resting beside his tray. His thumb brushed against the worn metal cover. The familiar sadness returned to his eyes. Sophie felt it instantly. The room seemed quieter. The storm outside seemed farther away. Damien stared at the watch for several long seconds before speaking. "There was a time," he said softly, "when I used to laugh a lot more." Then he closed the watch and slipped it back into his pocket. Sophie did not press him. But as they sat together beneath the soft cafeteria lights, she realized they were standing at the edge of a story he had spent years refusing to tell. The conversation lingered in Sophie's mind for days. There had been something different about the way Damien spoke that evening. For months she had watched him carefully avoid certain subjects, redirect personal questions, and hide behind work whenever conversations became too real. But now the walls were beginning to crack. The following week arrived with a relentless schedule of board meetings, investor calls, and product launches. Yet even during the chaos, Sophie noticed subtle changes. Damien smiled more often. Not frequently, but enough for people to notice. He no longer ate lunch alone every day. He occasionally asked employees about their families. The transformation was so gradual that most people could not identify exactly when it started. They only knew that the man who once terrified an entire executive floor seemed different. One evening Sophie stayed late reviewing reports before a quarterly presentation. The office had emptied hours earlier. Around 8 o'clock she walked toward Damien's office and noticed the door slightly open. Inside, the desk lamp cast a warm glow across the room. Damien sat quietly with the silver pocket watch in one hand and an old photograph in the other. He did not notice her at first. Sophie hesitated, unsure whether to leave. Then Damien looked up. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally he gestured toward the chair across from him. "You can come in." Sophie sat carefully. The photograph remained face down on the desk. Damien stared at the pocket watch. "Do you know why May 14th is on that list?" Sophie slowly shook her head. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows. For the first time since she had met him, Damien seemed ready to stop carrying the burden alone. "My sister's name was Claire," he said quietly. "She was 12 years younger than me." Sophie listened without interrupting. "She was the kind of person who could make friends with anyone. She talked too much. She laughed at everything. She never met a stranger." A faint smile appeared and disappeared. "She used to tell people that one day she was going to run my company because I was too serious." Sophie could almost picture it. Damien looked down at the watch. This belonged to her. His thumb brushed across the scratched silver surface. "The last time I saw her was on May 14th. I promised I would pick her up after school that afternoon." His voice became quieter. "A major investor flew into Chicago unexpectedly. I chose the meeting instead." Sophie felt her chest tighten. Damien stared toward the skyline. "The meeting ran late." By the time I called, she had already left with another ride home. He swallowed hard. An accident happened that day. Silence filled the room. Sophie finally understood. The list. The watch. The sadness that never left his eyes. For years Damien had blamed himself for a tragedy he could not undo. I keep thinking that if I had gone myself, everything would have been different, he admitted. So I stopped doing the things we used to enjoy together. Baseball games. Music. Birthdays. The lake. It felt wrong to enjoy any of it. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Then she gently said, Claire would probably hate that. Damien blinked. What? You just described someone who loved life. Sophie offered a small smile. Do you really think she would want you to stop living yours? The question hung in the air. Damien looked away first. His eyes glistened beneath the soft office light. For the first time in years, someone had challenged the story he had been telling himself. And deep down, a part of him was beginning to wonder if she was right. For a while, it seemed as though everything was finally moving in the right direction. Damien no longer carried every burden alone. Sophie no longer felt like she was simply surviving each day. The executive floor felt lighter. Even the board members noticed the difference. Unfortunately, not everyone welcomed the change. Richard Holloway certainly did not. As Walker Technologies' senior vice president, Richard had spent years positioning himself as the person closest to Damien. He knew how the company worked. He knew how to navigate the board. Most importantly, he knew how to benefit from a CEO who kept everyone at a distance. Sophie's arrival had disrupted that balance. The more Damien trusted her, the less influence Richard seemed to have. At first his frustration appeared in subtle ways. A dismissive comment during meetings. A cold smile when Sophie entered the room. Small things that were easy to ignore. Then the quarterly board presentation approached. It was one of the most important events of the year. Investors from across the country would attend. Every report, projection, and financial document had to be flawless. Sophie spent days preparing materials. Late one evening she finished organizing confidential presentation files and secured them in Damien's office before heading home. The next morning, chaos erupted. Damien's office door slammed open. His voice echoed through the executive floor. Everyone into the conference room. Now. Employees exchanged nervous looks. Sophie felt her stomach drop. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Inside the conference room, Damien stood beside a large screen displaying confidential company projections. Information that should never have left the executive team. Information that somehow appeared on a business news website overnight. The room buzzed with concern. Board members whispered. Executives stared at one another. Damien's expression had returned to the cold mask Sophie had not seen in months. These files were accessed yesterday evening, he said. According to security records, only 3 people opened them. Sophie listened carefully. Richard sat quietly near the end of the table. Too quietly. Damien continued. Myself. Richard. And Sophie. The room fell silent. Sophie felt every eye turned toward her. What? She whispered. Damien placed several printed documents on the table. Security logs. Access records. Timestamps. Every piece of evidence pointed directly toward her. Sophie stared at the papers in disbelief. That is impossible. Richard sighed heavily. Nobody wants to believe it. Sophie immediately looked at him. Something about his performance felt rehearsed. I did not leak anything. Then explain the records, Richard replied. Damien remained silent. That silence hurt more than any accusation. Sophie turned toward him. You know me. For a brief second uncertainty flickered across his face. Then he looked away. The gesture felt like a door closing. Sophie suddenly understood. Months of trust. Months of progress. One crisis had shattered all of it. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I would never betray this company. Nobody responded. The room remained painfully still. Sophie slowly gathered her notebook from the table. "If that is what you believe," she said quietly to Damien, "then there is nothing I can say." She walked out before anyone could stop her. Hours later, her resignation sat on Damien's desk. By sunset, her workstation stood empty. And for the first time since Sophie Bennett had entered Walker Technologies, the executive floor felt cold again. The first few days after Sophie left felt strangely hollow. Walker Technologies continued operating. Meetings continued. Investors continued calling. On paper, nothing had changed. Yet Damien felt the difference everywhere. The empty desk outside his office greeted him every morning. The silence in the hallway lingered longer than it should have. Even the coffee tasted different. By the end of the week, he realized something he had been unwilling to admit. The company was functioning. He was not. Then the truth arrived from a place he never expected. Late Friday afternoon, the head of cybersecurity requested an emergency meeting. Damien entered the conference room expecting another update about the leaked documents. Instead, a series of reports appeared on the screen. Access logs. Network records. Deleted files that had been recovered from company servers. As the evidence unfolded, Damien felt his stomach tighten. The breach had not come from Sophie. It had originated from Richard Holloway's credentials. More disturbing still, investigators discovered that security records had been manipulated to redirect suspicion towards Sophie. The room fell silent. Richard attempted explanations. Then excuses? Then blame. None of it survived the evidence. Within an hour, he was gone. Yet the victory felt empty. Damien stared at the reports long after everyone else left. Every document pointed to one painful conclusion. Sophie had been telling the truth. And when she needed him to trust her most, he had failed. That evening he returned to his office and found himself looking at the empty chair where Sophie used to sit. A memory surfaced. Her smile after seeing another item checked off the list. Her laugh when he finally attended a baseball game. Her voice asking whether Claire would really want him to stop living. For months she had believed in him when he could not believe in himself. He had repaid that trust with doubt. As he opened his desk drawer, something unexpected caught his attention. A sealed envelope rested beneath several folders. His name appeared on the front in familiar handwriting. Sophie. Confused, he carefully opened it. Inside was a folded letter and a small photograph. Damien unfolded the letter first. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Sophie explained that she had found the photograph months earlier after it slipped from one of his old files. She had intended to return it but noticed something tucked behind it. Another letter. A letter written years ago by Claire. Sophie had protected it because she believed he was not ready to read it yet. Until now. Damien's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the second page. Claire's handwriting filled the paper. The words were simple. Warm. Full of life. Near the bottom, one sentence stopped him completely. If anything ever goes wrong, promise me you will not blame yourself for every bad thing in the world. You are my big brother, not a superhero. Tears blurred his vision. For years he had carried guilt like a punishment. For years he had built walls around his heart because he believed suffering was what he deserved. Yet the person he mourned most had never wanted that burden for him. As the city lights shimmered beyond the windows, Damien closed his eyes and finally allowed himself to let go of a weight he had carried for far too long. Then he stood, picked up his coat, and headed for the door. There was one more person he needed to find. And this time, he intended to make things right. Damien found Sophie 3 days later in the last place he expected. She was working at a small community arts center on the north side of Chicago, helping children and adults paint murals across a brick wall that faced a neighborhood park. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the sidewalk as Damien stepped out of his car and stood quietly for a moment. Sophie was laughing. Really laughing. The sound caught him off guard because he realized how much he had missed it. She noticed him a few seconds later. The smile faded. Neither moved. The distance between them felt much larger than the few yards separating them. Finally, Damien walked forward. The security reports were fake, he said. I know. Sophie folded her arms gently. I figured that out when the news broke. Damien lowered his eyes. You were telling the truth. I was. And I did not trust you. The honesty in his voice left no room for excuses. Sophie studied him carefully. For the first time since she had met him, Damien Walker looked completely unguarded. No billionaire confidence. No executive authority. Just a man trying to fix a mistake. He reached into his coat pocket and removed the silver pocket watch. Sophie immediately recognized it. Claire's letter changed everything, he said quietly. For years I thought carrying the guilt was the same thing as honoring her memory. He looked toward the park where families laughed beneath the afternoon sun. You were right. She would have hated that. A faint smile appeared on Sophie's face. Damien took another step closer. I spent years pushing people away because I was afraid of losing them. His voice softened. Then I met a woman who spilled coffee on a $50 million deal. Sophie laughed despite herself. I was wondering when that would come up again. It should. His eyes held hers. Because that disaster changed my life. For a moment neither spoke. The city noise faded into the background. Damien carefully opened the pocket watch and looked at the tiny photograph of Claire inside. Then he closed it and placed it in Sophie's hands. Her eyes widened immediately. Damien, for years I carried it because I was afraid to let go. He smiled softly. Now I carry her here. He placed a hand over his heart. Sophie looked down at the watch, overwhelmed. I cannot take this. You already helped me find what it was supposed to remind me of. His gaze never left hers. How to live again. Several weeks later, Walker Technologies held its annual company celebration inside a ballroom overlooking the Chicago River. Hundreds of employees filled the room. When Damien stepped onto the stage, the applause was immediate. But instead of beginning his prepared remarks, he searched the crowd until he found Sophie standing near the back. Before anything else, he said into the microphone, there is someone I need to thank. The room grew quiet. Damien walked down from the stage and crossed the ballroom floor. Employees